Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
Good morning. Appreciate the presence of each and every one of you here. Appreciate the opportunity, as always, to be able to get up and speak from God's Word, and hope that you'll find some relevance to the things that we talk about this morning, as well as some connection to the overall theme for the year about looking at the kingdom. It's if it's true that we are part of God's kingdom, then I suppose it ought to be true as well that we should want to see God's kingdom growing, that we should never have the attitude that, that we're just going to kind of sit back and let the world take care of itself and become kind of isolationist about, the world out there is doing so much bad or so much that's not in line with God's will, or however you want to phrase it, that the world out there is so different than us that we should just kind of recede from the world and let the world do the worldly things, and we'll kind of focus on ourselves, and we'll just exist within that kind of that sphere of being separated from the world. I hope that as we study the kingdom and through the year and the effect that the kingdom is supposed to have and what the kingdom is supposed to be like, I hope that we come to the conclusion and see the fact that the kingdom is supposed to be vibrant and alive and expressive within the world, and that we are supposed to engage the world in the conversation about who God is and what he wants from us and what he expects from us. And so that's sort of where this lesson comes from today, and we will talk more about the idea of the kingdom growing through the course of the year and how we can be involved in that and specific things that we can do. But as I was thinking about sort of how to title this lesson or how to approach this topic for today, I went with the idea of Evangelism 101, kind of an introductory course to evangelism, because sometimes and often it seems like when we just say that word evangelism that we start to get a little panicky, a little bit scared of what that means, and the fact that evangelism itself could be a daunting task when we think of all the work that needs to be done and all the people that need to be reached and all the different scenarios that can come up in talking to people about the gospel. It just becomes very scary at times and very daunting to think about what needs to take place. And let's face it, evangelism involves risk. If we're going to talk to people about the gospel, if we're going to talk to people about the Bible, about how they should be living, about sin, about eternal life, about all of those things, if we're going to talk to people about those things, then there's a very real possibility that they will reject us, that they will not agree with what we say, that they will not like what we say. And so it inherently involves risk. Even talking to a good friend or a loved one about the gospel can bring with it the risk of rejection or the risk of not being able to make yourself clear. And so it also brings the risk of opening ourselves up to scrutiny. If we're out there preaching a certain thing, then that invites people to examine our lives and look at the way that we are living and see if the way that we are living matches up with the things that we are preaching. And so that is another aspect of evangelism that sometimes brings some anxiety with it. And then sometimes we also feel that evangelism is somebody else's job. Whose job really is evangelism when you look at the New Testament? Weren't there a select group of people that Jesus gave the Great Commission to? Weren't there a select group of people that went around preaching from city to city? And this little group of people were the ones that were responsible for evangelizing. And so if we're talking about just a small group of people, why should I feel the burden? Why should, just a regular person sitting in a church pew feel that it's their responsibility to get out and evangelize? And so all of those things fit into this sort of this lesson today, and this idea of what's going on with evangelism and how do we get involved in it and how do we do it? How do we approach it? And so there are lots of evangelistic programs out there, and we've looked at some over the years. Look at the book and some other programs that kind of get you into the the nuts and bolts of evangelism, but today we're really looking at kind of the reasons why or how we can all be involved in evangelism. And the conclusion that we need to reach is this, that we all have a role to play in evangelism. Every single one of us. There's something that we can do to help reach others for Christ. We can do something to help grow the kingdom of God. It may not be the same thing that somebody else does. We don't all have the same jobs, the same roles, even the same responsibilities, but we all do have some responsibility and some work that we can do in building up the kingdom. So looking at this passage in Colossians chapter 4, I felt like it was a good place for us to start. And we've already read the passage, and so I'm just going to put the passage up at various times through the lesson with just little pieces of it highlighted in bold print there for you to look at. And that's kind of where each individual point of the lesson this morning comes from. So he starts off with this idea of saying, devote yourselves to prayer. And it's that idea of devoting ourselves to prayer. We talked a couple of weeks ago about prayer for the kingdom, about being a people of prayer and how important prayer is in the kingdom. But today let's talk specifically about how prayer relates to evangelism. And Paul says, be devoted in prayer. In Matthew chapter 9, Jesus there relates an instance or is talking, and he uses an interesting phrase in Matthew chapter 9, verses 35 to 38. Jesus was going about all the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. And seeing the multitudes, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. It's that word beseech that caught my attention as I read through that passage. It's not a word that we use very often in our vernacular. It's kind of an antiquated word. And so I did what I often do, and I've referred back to my upbringing with the American Standard, and this is New American Standard language, but the American Standard actually says pray that the Lord of harvest. So I thought it was interesting that the older version in this case used a word that we're more familiar with. But in this case, that word beseech, and then when we are directing that word towards God, it's very appropriate to use the word pray in that instance. And this word is a word that we see several times through the New Testament in various contexts. In Luke chapter 5, there's a man who has leprosy, and he implores Jesus. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean, and that word implore. And so if you can imagine what it's like to have leprosy, and especially back then when there was no medical treatment for it, and having leprosy meant being excluded and cast out from society, and you were literally removed from society just waiting to die. And he implores Jesus, if you will, make me clean. That's the same word as devoting ourselves to prayer. It's that same idea of the way that a leprous man would implore the one who could heal him, could save him from that disease. And so when we're thinking about the lost of this world and we're praying for the lost, we are devoting ourselves to praying. We are imploring. We are beseeching that the Lord would send workers into the harvest field. In Luke chapter 9, that word is used again. In this case, it was a man whose son had an evil spirit. And he comes to Jesus and he says, Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. It's that word beg. And then he goes on to say, I begged your disciples to cast out the spirit, but they couldn't do it. And so this shows us that it's not just a one and done thing. It's not that he went and begged the disciples and they couldn't do it. And so the dad said, well, I've done all I can do. No, he went on and he begged Jesus to do it as well. And so as we are devoting ourselves to prayer for the lost, to the growth of the kingdom, it's not a one and done thing. It's not like, well, I prayed for that last week, so I don't need to pray for the growth of the kingdom again. No, it's an ongoing, continuous thing. We are begging that God will send workers into the harvest. And then in Acts chapter 10, we know the story of Cornelius and how Cornelius was a God-fearer. He was a Gentile, but he gave alms to the Jews, and it says he prayed to God continually. And it's that word continually that's the same word. He was devoted to prayer. He prayed all the time about the kingdom that God had promised. And so when we devote ourselves to prayer, when Paul says devote yourselves to prayer, he's not speaking to a group of super Christians. He's not sending this letter to the church in Colossae to a select few people and saying, you people over there, you go pray, and the average people, they've got nothing to do with this. No, he was writing this to the church, to the congregation of the church in Colossae, and he was saying, you, all of you, pray, devote yourselves to prayer. And so whose job is it? Well, it's ours. It's our job to devote ourselves to prayer for the growth of the kingdom. Paul goes on to say next in Colossians chapter 4 there, he says that we're to be alert. He says, devote yourselves to prayer, keeping alert in it. That is, keeping alert in prayer. And so this idea of being alert in prayer was an interesting one to me. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 18, we have this verse that says, with all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for the saints. And this is part of that, kind of the end of that part of Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul is talking about the gospel armor. So he talks about the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit and those things. And then he concludes that section by saying, and praying at all times in the Spirit, and being alert in prayer with perseverance and petition for all the saints. So it's an interesting thought. You know, a soldier's armor is not going to do him any good if he's got no idea of what's going on around him, if he's not alert. If a soldier falls asleep in his foxhole, doesn't matter what body armor he has on, it doesn't matter how he's protected. If he's asleep in the foxhole, the enemy can sneak up and get him. And so that gospel armor that we have is only effective if we are alert. And that gospel armor is what we have to resist the devil, but it's also the armor that we have to go out and evangelize with. And so we stay alert. We keep our eyes open to the opportunities that are around us. You know, prayers sometimes are just kind of a stream of consciousness, an informal thing. Do you find yourself talking to God sometimes through the day just kind of on a whim or in a moment when you really don't have a set time to be praying, but something's happened or something's come up and you find yourself talking to God? That's good. We need to keep doing that. We always need to be people who continually go to God in prayer, but there's also the idea of being more formal about our prayers. And there needs to be a time that is set aside when we are going to specifically pray about certain things. And I think that's this idea of being alert. Saying, you know, I know that there's work that needs to be done in this world to see God's kingdom grow, and I'm going to devote part of my time in prayer every day to praying for that outcome, for praying for God's kingdom in that way. And I'm going to formalize that. I'm going to really think about what I say, and I'm going to really involve myself in my heart in that prayer, so that it's not just a haphazard prayer. It's not just if I have time or if I remember to pray about it, then I'll mention, you know, let's see your kingdom grow, God. But it's a specific and set part of our prayer life that is formal and intentional. It's planned out. It's considered. And we're really thinking about that. I think that's what Paul means when he says be alert in your prayers about the kingdom. Paul also says to be thankful in the next section there. He says, with an attitude of thanksgiving. And Philippians 4:6 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And I think this indicates to us that thankfulness is the backdrop for our prayer life. Thankfulness is the context in which our prayer life resides. It's not that we're always happy. We talked about this Wednesday night in Bible class. It's not that we always have to go around with a smile on our face and we never let the things going on around us affect us, or we never feel anything about what's going on around us, but simply that we understand that even in the midst of turmoil, even in the midst of difficulties, we have things that we can be thankful about. And that's the backdrop for our prayer life. That's the context in which we pray. Think of it this way. The thing that motivates me to pray for the lost is the realization that I have found that which I need to be saved. And so if we can put it in that context, that idea that because there's this outpouring of gratitude to God for what he has done for me, and because of what he has done for me, I want to share that with other people, and I want to see other people being led to the truth as well. That's the thankfulness that we're talking about in this context. Being thankful for what God has done for us so that we can see it happen to other people as well. And then finally there in that section, Paul, in relation to prayer, he talks about open doors. He says, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us a door for the word. The idea of open doors is something that we should include in our prayers. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 19 and 20, Paul says, and pray on my behalf that utterance may be given to me in the opening of my mouth to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that in proclaiming it I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. So pray on my behalf that as I have the opportunity to speak to other people about the gospel, that I take advantage of that opportunity, that I see it for what it is, and that I don't miss that opportunity because I was unprepared or not ready for it. And so open doors is about two aspects of it. First of all, praying that those doors will appear, that there will be the opportunity to speak, but also that when that opportunity presents itself, that I will be ready to speak, and I'll know what to say, and I'll have the ability to say the things that will motivate somebody else towards the Lord. We need to pray for open doors on at least three different levels. First of all, we need to pray personally. There are people that you know that I don't. There are people that you know that nobody else in this room knows. And you need to be praying personally for opportunities that you can impact those people for the Lord, that you can have doors open to you, that you can speak to them about the gospel. And when it's time to speak, or when that opportunity presents itself, that you have the ability to speak. You need to also pray locally, not just on a personal level, but also locally. Pray for the local kingdom. Pray that, not just as I'm going through my day that I have opportunities, but pray that other people in our congregation, as they're going through their day, that they have opportunities, that they have the ability to say and do the things that would lead others to Christ. And then, of course, we also need to be praying globally. There are 7 billion people on this planet. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that narrow is the way and straight is the gate that leads to salvation, and few there be that find it. Wide is the way and broad is the gate that leads to destruction, and many there be that enter therein. And so 7 billion people, and most of them don't know the Lord. And we need to be praying fervently that God will open doors so that those who don't know Him can come to know Him. The first part of evangelism, I think, has to begin with prayer. If we can become people of prayer, if we can pray for the kingdom and the growth of the kingdom, then that's a great starting place. That's a necessary starting place. I don't think we can start anywhere else. But that's not all that is involved with evangelism. Another part of a basic evangelism, something that we all can concern ourselves with, something that we can all be a part of, is watching our conduct. Paul says, conduct yourselves with wisdom. Conduct yourselves with wisdom. And so the first thing about our conduct that we need to take note of is that we are living according to wisdom. James chapter 3, verses 13 to 18. James here gives us a contrast between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom, or wisdom from above. He says, who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And so James there contrasts between the wisdom from above and the wisdom that is earthly. And if we are to be people who conduct ourselves according to wisdom, then we need to be living our lives within the context of godly wisdom, of wisdom from above. And so James there enumerates several things that relate to living wise lives. He says, first, be good, be gentle, pure, peaceable, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruit, unwavering, without hypocrisy, righteous. All of those things are hallmarks of a life lived according to godly wisdom. And if we are ignoring those things, if we're not actively pursuing those things, then I'm not sure that we could say that we are pursuing godly wisdom. We need to be people who are pursuing those things. And contrast that with earthly wisdom. James there has a list that includes things like bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, arrogant, lies, jealousy, disorder, and every evil thing. You know, look at those two lists of things and decide for yourself, which kind of people do you want to surround yourself with? Which kind of people do you want to be around on a daily basis? Do you want to be around people who live according to godly wisdom or people who live according to earthly wisdom? And then decide also for yourself, which kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be a person of earthly wisdom or godly wisdom? We cannot be effective at evangelism if our lives are not consistent with the message that we preach. We need to be living lives that are guided by godly wisdom in order for our message to be heard. Paul there in Colossians chapter 4, after he says that we should conduct ourselves with wisdom, he specifically says toward outsiders. And so in the context of being people who are trying to see the kingdom grow or reaching out to those who are lost, it makes sense that Paul would designate specifically that we want to conduct ourselves with wisdom toward outsiders. That doesn't mean I get to cheat and lie to you guys because you're already in the kingdom. That just means I need to take special consideration to conducting myself with wisdom towards people who are outside the kingdom, to have an influence and an impact upon them. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12 says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." You know, it's easy to live right around others who are doing the same. I find it easy on Sunday mornings when I'm surrounded by all of you guys to say and do the right things. It's pretty easy because you guys are an encouragement, and we're all oriented towards the same goal. We're all striving towards the same thing. It's harder when surrounded by worldly-minded people at our jobs or at school or out in the neighborhood. It's more difficult at those times, I think, to find ourselves doing and saying the right things. People watch us to see if our lives are consistent with our teaching, to see if what they know we come here and talk about on Sunday mornings is the same thing that we're out there doing on Monday afternoons and Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings. People are watching to see if what we preach is the same thing that we practice. And some people really enjoy pointing out the inconsistencies that they find. They really enjoy saying, you know, I know you guys believe this, but I see you doing that. How come that is? How come you're not being consistent? Some people really enjoy doing that, and in doing that, they're revealing that they don't have a heart that is trying to be led towards the gospel. They're looking for an excuse to not follow God. And you know what? We might give them that excuse at times by the way that we act. And we need to watch the way that we conduct ourselves, especially towards outsiders, because we need to understand that there will be people who are drawn toward the gospel because of the life that they see us live. If we are living consistently with what we preach, then that will have an impact on the lost. So we need to be people who are living according to wisdom. Paul also says there in Colossians chapter 4, he says, conducting ourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity, not letting opportunities be wasted, and not missing out on the chance to say or do the right thing because we weren't ready. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 through 17 says, "Therefore, be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is." You know, you've all heard the expression, you never get a second chance to do what? To make a first impression, right? There are opportunities that are lost, and they will never come back. Sometimes we can recover from those. Sometimes we can get that mulligan and get an opportunity to kind of go back and reset things, and we can get an honest second chance. But very often, once we miss that opportunity, it's gone, and it's gone forever. And Paul, in a couple of places here, has instructed us that we need to make the most of the opportunities that we're given. We need to make sure that when we have the chance to influence somebody for good, that we take that in the moment that it's given, because we're not guaranteed another chance. Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 says, "Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." Let us not lose heart or grow weary in doing good. Let us never take a day off from doing good, thinking that, you know what, I'm going to take the day off from living a good life today, and I'm just going to assume that I don't come into contact with anybody today that it's going to matter about, that is really looking for the gospel. Because that's the day when somebody may come into our life when we have the opportunity to influence them. Don't take the day off from living the life that we should live. Are there moments in your life that you wish you could have back? I think we all probably would say yes to that. You know, we all lose opportunities, and opportunities are lost every day. And think about the eternal consequences that has in the grand scheme of things for those that are not being influenced to do the right thing because those opportunities have been lost. Next, after instructing us about our conduct, next there in Colossians chapter 4, Paul talks to us about our speech. He says, let your speech always be with grace. I think Paul starts with the easiest part of what it is that he wants us to understand, and he works his way towards the harder part. Because talking about conducting ourselves with wisdom, that's a tall order. But then getting to the idea of letting our speech always be conducted with grace, that one's tough. And that one is one that I know I mess up a lot. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, that it may give grace to those who hear. That word unwholesome there, he says, let no unwholesome word come out of your mouth. That word literally means rotten or putrid, something that is decaying. And when you think about, having that word in your mouth, having it proceed from your mouth, if something rotten or putrid or decaying is in your mouth, it's not fit for consumption. It's not supposed to be there. It's not where it belongs. And so having something come out of our mouth that is like that is just unbecoming. It's not the way that we were designed for. It's not how we were made. And he goes on to say that it should be according to the need of the moment. And this is one of those things that the more time you spend around somebody who's good at this, the more I think you become aware of how much you have to grow in this area, because there are people that do a really good job with this. Whenever I read this verse, I always think of Lou Wall and just her ability to say the right thing at the right time, or to always have the exact thing that somebody needs to hear on her lips. And what a woman of tremendous grace she was. Proverbs chapter 25, verses 11 to 13 reminds us this. It says, like apples of gold and settings of silver is a word spoken in right circumstances. Like an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Like the cold of snow in the time of harvest is a faithful messenger to those who send him, for he refreshes the soul of his masters. What a tremendous series of word pictures there from Solomon as he instructs us about how important it is to say the right thing at the right time, and to be people who are focused on saying the right thing at the right time. Some people make it look effortless. Some people just seem to know how to do it and how to say that right thing at the right time, and they always get it right. And then others of us just kind of bumble along, and maybe sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we stick our foot in our mouth, or we forget we even have feet at all, or something. But it's difficult to do. But people who are good at it make it look effortless. And to those who are hearing it, to those who are receiving it, it feels so sincere, and it seems to really make an impact upon those who hear. And so the question then is, how do we become those kind of people? How do we do that? If I'm not good at this now, if I'm not a person who knows the right thing to say at the right time, how do I become that person? Because I don't think Paul is instructing us to do something here that is out of reach for most of us. Well, he goes on to tell us this, that our speech should be seasoned with salt. He says, that our speech should be with grace as though seasoned with salt. And so that brings up another interesting word picture in association with this idea of speech. He says, seasoned with salt. And with salt, the correct amount is important. Too much is not good, and not enough is not good. But when you get it just right, it's great. And so it's kind of that way with our speech as well. The right word at the right time. Sometimes we're so worried about saying the wrong thing that we say nothing. I'm so worried that what I might say in this moment will offend you that I'm not going to say anything. And in not saying anything, I've missed the opportunity. I've missed the chance that I had to try to influence you in some way. And so that's how speech is compared to salt there, that it needs to be the right amount at the right time. In Mark chapter 9, verse 50, Jesus said, "Salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." You know, today, in our vernacular today, I hear the word salty all the time at the middle school. I'll hear somebody say something really rude, and then another student will say, "Ooh, that's salty." And they're getting at the idea there that went too far. That was too much. I noticed what you said. It went beyond what I was expecting. And so Jesus here is telling us that, you know, it's not good to have too little salt. It's not too good to have too much salt. It needs to be the right amount for the moment, and it needs to do what it was intended to do in that moment. And if we get that right, then we have peace with one another. If we don't go far enough, or if we go too far, then peace is in jeopardy. And when we're talking about evangelism, it's not just peace with us, it's peace with God. And so if we go too far, or we don't go far enough in the moment, then we jeopardize somebody's peace with their Creator. And so we need to be people whose speech is with grace and seasoned with salt, saying the right thing at the right time. But again, how do we do that? Well, the last thing Paul that says there in Colossians chapter 4 is that, Colossians chapter 4, there we go. Well, looks like it got cut off. It wasn't cut off on my originally. Sorry about that. Colossians chapter 4, verse, at the very end there it says, conduct yourselves with wisdom, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt, so that you may know how you should respond to each person. That's what it says, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 4. We've already been there, but back in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 through 27, says, "Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you with his neighbors. For we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity." And then skip down to verse 31. It says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you." And I think all of these things here relate to our speech and relate to that idea of not letting any unwholesome word come out of our mouths, but letting our voices, our speech be with grace and seasoned with salt. And I think the way that we do that, the way that we become people who are able to master that, is through experience. And that may not be what we want to hear, because that means I need to go out and try it. I need to go out and do it. And I think what we want sometimes is the idea that I can be trained up in how to go out and evangelize or share my faith story, or I can go out and talk to people about the gospel, and I'm going to train myself until the point that I know I'm going to get it right every time, and I'm not going to go out and mess it up. But that's not the way you learn how to do it. The way you learn how to do it is through doing it, through experience, through practice, through maturity. And so if we're going to be people who are speaking with grace, seasoned with salt, appropriate to the experience of the moment, then we need to be out there speaking with grace, seasoned with salt, according to the need of the moment. We need to be out there doing that. And if we're not doing it, then we're never going to grow in that skill or in that ability. So that leads us to this morning, our call for action. Our call to action is this: the kingdom will grow if every kingdom dweller can confidently say that evangelism is my job. If we get to the point where evangelism is someone else's job, then the kingdom is not only not growing, the kingdom is probably dying out. But if every member, if every kingdom dweller confidently asserts evangelism is my job, I'm going to go out and I'm going to pray. I'm going to devote myself to prayer. And I'm going to pray for the lost, and I'm going to pray for laborers to be sent into the field to harvest. And I'm going to conduct myself with wisdom so that every moment of every day when I'm around people, that if I have the opportunity to lead somebody to the Lord, I'm going to do that because they'll see my conduct and they'll know that my life matches my preaching. And I'm going to speak to people with grace, and I'm going to season my language with salt so that I know I'll say the right thing at the right time in the right way, in the right amount. That's what we need to be. And if we are all people that are committed to doing that, then I believe that we'll see the kingdom grow. And I believe that's what God wants from all of us. This morning, the lesson is yours. I appreciate your attention, and hopefully as we continue to study the kingdom, we can all be people who will be committed to the idea of the kingdom growing at every opportunity. If you have any need to bring before the congregation this morning, would you please come while we stand and sing?